We could tell 2 or 3 weeks before that there was going to be a Chinese attack on Vietnam, but it was very hard, and I think indeed impossible to foresee that it would be an attack in multi-divisional strength.
Journalist and China watcher David Bonavia, with his view of hostilities between two communist neighbours, China and Vietnam. The action started in earnest on February the 17th, when Chinese forces pushed their way into Vietnamese territory at 26 separate points along the border. Their aim? To punish Vietnam for what they said were repeated border violations. In the first 2 weeks, China claimed it had put more than 17,000 Vietnamese out of action, while Vietnam counted it had wiped out over 22,000 Chinese. The main battleground is hilly country across Vietnam's northern provinces, and it's a region that's no stranger to war. It's here that French forces were finally beaten by the Vietnamese nationalists at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This time, Vietnamese defences have consisted of border troops and local militia. They withdrew where possible as the Chinese advanced, but the Vietnamese weren't running away from a fight. They were soon to counterattack. There was heavy fighting around Lao Cai along the border in the Red River Valley. These were some of the earliest Vietnamese casualties. The Chinese were saying they only intended to take limited action and had no desire to win territory. It sounded as if they were speaking from a position of strength. But Chinese personnel captured by Vietnam proved things weren't all going China's way. These two prisoners were displayed to visiting newsmen, who were told one was a soldier, the other an intelligence agent. All civilians were evacuated from the fighting areas, and after a few days of skirmishing, the Vietnamese began sending in their regular troops. If the Chinese were hoping to make a quick incursion, similar to their thrust down into India in 1962, and then withdraw victoriously, they were to be disappointed. For the Vietnamese fought back strongly, and now China has conceded that Vietnamese units have broken through its lines at least twice, forcing the battle into China itself. Both sides took their dispute to the United Nations. China accused Vietnam of aggression and urged the Security Council to stop Vietnam invading Chinese soil. But at a press conference, the Vietnamese ambassador, Ha Van Lao, was able to describe the Chinese attacks in detail.
Saying that the Chinese authorities now are withdrawing their troops from the border. It is not true.
Vietnam took the position that while it was prepared to negotiate, it was equally determined to defend its territory. Both sides, it seemed, were preparing to fight on. The battleground's a broad arc along the border, with key points in the Red River Valley and the inaptly named Friendship Pass. The biggest battle's been around the provincial capital of Lang Son, a vital crossroads for rail, water and convoy. It's hard to say where the conflict will end, but the recent history of Southeast Asia can explain where it began. May 1975, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong tanks roll into Saigon, soon to be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. China was a close ally of the North Vietnamese in the war against the United States and the South. It gave arms and aid, as did the Soviet Union. So the victory of 1975 should have set the seal on the Sino-Vietnamese alliance. Similar takeovers in neighbouring Laos and Cambodia should also have heralded an era of communist cooperation. But the spirit of those early days has not been sustained. What went wrong? To find out, we went to Hong Kong, the British Crown colony on the Chinese mainland. Hong Kong's the base of many journalists specializing in Far Eastern affairs. We put the question to one of them, China expert David Bonavia. Why the present rift?
Because during the war, the underlying differences between China and Vietnam on all sorts of questions were covered over in the interests of solidarity and alliance. And when North Vietnam won the war in 1975, there was no longer such a pressing reason for the Chinese and the Vietnamese to cover up their differences. One of the differences that quickly arose in 1975 was whether or not it was necessary for Vietnam, principally North Vietnam, to keep up its large armed forces and indeed continue supplying them with new equipment. Because the Chinese felt that now the war was over, the Vietnamese should get down to the task of rebuilding their economy. However, the Vietnamese wanted to keep their armed forces strong, apparently because they foresaw the forthcoming conflict with Cambodia, and the Chinese nowadays accuse them of having wanted to set up an Indochina federation, including Cambodia and Laos. And the Chinese consider now that this was an expansionist and an aggressive aim on Hanoi's part. And they say that the late Premier Zhou Enlai said to Vietnam in 1975, please just give us some breathing space. We've been supplying you all this time, and now we have to do something about our own economy. And when, on top of that, the Vietnamese went into a war with China's allies in Cambodia, the situation became well-nigh intolerable, so that the exacerbation of conflicts on the frontier and the Chinese expulsion of many of the over 1 million ethnic Chinese in both North and South Vietnam built up to a point where the Chinese felt they could no longer tolerate the situation any longer. This was made even worse by the fact that Vietnam was in general following the Soviet line on international affairs and world politics, which to the Chinese was absolute anathema.
After the war, the Vietnamese were left with a massive arsenal of weapons, some supplied by their allies, but also those captured from the Americans. The North Vietnamese fought that war largely without the benefit of air power. They were simply unprepared to compete with the Americans at that time. And though they finally won, they learned at first hand how devastating airstrikes could be. The Vietnamese are now able to operate with confidence the various US aircraft that fell into their hands, though the backbone of their new air force is formed by Soviet-built MiG-21 jet fighters. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong did use tanks in the war. Though the heavy vegetation and frequently wet terrain of the region wasn't ideally suited to tank warfare, nobody knew better how to operate them than the Vietnamese themselves. It wasn't to be long before the army had a chance to use its skill. Early in 1978, a festering border dispute with Cambodia, then under so-called Khmer Rouge government, erupted into large-scale fighting. Accusing Cambodia of aggression, Vietnam hit back hard, and it was the tanks and aircraft leading the strike that proved most effective. And so Vietnam was once again on a war footing, drafting more young people and training local militia. As if to justify these moves, the Vietnamese released film showing the border fighting with Cambodia. Villages in border areas suffered most, with schools and churches destroyed. For the first time, Western correspondents began talking about a war of proxy between the two big communist powers, with the Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge facing the increasingly Soviet-backed Vietnam government. There were accusations of atrocities on both sides, reflecting the long-standing enmity between the two peoples. The situation got worse after 1975, when the civil war in Cambodia was won by the Khmer Rouge, who used wide-scale terror to impose their strict communist ideology, a brand of Maoism on the population. Soon, thousands of Cambodian refugees began crossing the border into Vietnam. While the border clashes were continuing, in January 1978, Madame Teng Ying Chow, the widow of the former Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai, made a visit to Cambodia. There she had talks with the Khmer leader, Pol Pot. It was seen as confirmation of China's support for the Khmer Rouge against the Vietnamese. Not surprisingly, a disgusted Radio Hanoi chose to ignore her visit completely. In spite of Vietnam's big strike across the Cambodian border, the fighting continued throughout 1978. The Vietnamese were clearly the better equipped forces, but as they themselves had shown against the Americans, guerrilla warfare can succeed against mighty military odds. With 2/3 of the 1,000-kilometre border being disputed, and with isolated villages as the targets, it was an ideal situation for irregular forces. And that's why this time the Vietnamese had to forget their tanks and aircraft and go back to basic defences manned by local militia. Vietnam saw all this as a defence of its legitimate borders. China saw it as aggression on its Cambodian ally. China was also annoyed at the close economic links which Vietnam had formed with the Soviet Union. So, halfway through last year, Peking abruptly cut off all aid programs to Hanoi. It was a heavy blow, but it did nothing to stop the Vietnamese from continuing the border struggle. Protection of Vietnam's own interests wasn't the only motive. Hanoi claimed the excesses of the Pol Pot regime made any opposition to it a friendly act in support of the suffering Cambodian people. They described Pol Pot as an adventurer who had betrayed the Cambodian revolution and kept the country in terror and medieval obscurantism. The message was thrust home in re-education lectures given to Cambodians captured in the fighting. Vietnam's increasingly strident tone became even more evident in mid-December, when Vietnam's military leaders celebrated the 34th anniversary of the founding of their country's armed forces. Already, Vietnam's forces numbered over 600,000, the largest in Southeast Asia. Now they were to be strengthened still further. Also, Vietnam was publicly supporting a guerrilla group inside Cambodia, a fact announced by war hero General Giap. It was opposed to Pol Pot and called the Front for National Salvation. This was an obvious insult to China, and it was no surprise when the Chinese delegation walked out in protest. In January this year, the Salvation Front, backed by Vietnamese forces, invaded Cambodia and installed this man, Hang Samrin, in Phnom Penh. It was no surprise that Vietnam and the Soviet Union immediately recognized the new leadership, which was just as quick to broadcast its own version of events.
Dear compatriots, dear leaders and fighters, dear compatriots now residing abroad, our nation is facing a danger of extermination. Our fatherland, the Pol Pot Yang Sari clique drove millions of children to misery. They worked people to complete exhaustion. They broke up innumerable families. The Pol Pot Yang Sari clique forced millions of young people to commit armed aggression against Vietnam. They committed untold crimes against neighbouring countries whose people shared will and woe with our people for decades during the wars of resistance to French, then American aggression. My name is Hong. I live in Punya Rek district, Braziang province. 4 members of my family were massacred by Pol Pot Yang Sari agents. Pol Pot Yang Sari agents killed both my parents and all my brothers and sisters. Pol Pot Yang Sari soldiers massacred my entire family. I am now alone. The parents of his 2 children were also massacred.
As the Hang Samrin forces and the Vietnamese consolidated their victory, on Cambodia's main roads, refugees began returning to their homes and villages. There's no doubt that the Pol Pot regime had terrorized large sectors of the population, and this was borne out by scenes in the town of Pre Veng on Highway 1. There was evidence of mass killings, people who resisted the regime, and of many buildings being turned into makeshift prisons. Though Pol Pot had been ousted, he continued to resist, and much of the countryside is still in Khmer Rouge hands, tying down a large Vietnamese force inside Cambodia. The removal of this force is seen as one of China's aims in the conflict on its own borders. Meanwhile, it wasn't just Cambodia that brought Vietnam and China face to face. Throughout most of 1978, there was a steady stream of ethnic Chinese resident in Vietnam trying to return to their motherland. They claimed they'd been victimized and mistreated by the Vietnamese, and they came flocking to the border crossings in tens of thousands. To hold back the tide, in July, China closed the border entries. Trouble flared when Vietnamese frontier guards began stoning the refugees to force them across the border. According to the Chinese version of events, the refugees were waiting for documents issued by their own officials inside Vietnam to prevent alleged Vietnamese agents from smuggling themselves through. The refugees say their property and savings have been confiscated, and that the commerce and trades practiced by the Chinese had been nationalized. The vast majority of the so-called boat people who fled from Vietnam by sea were also ethnic Chinese. China clearly felt the obligation to look after the interests of these refugees, but it was overwhelmed by the numbers. So in mid-78, with relations worsening, China not only cut off economic aid to Vietnam, but also closed the border. Now, after trying in vain to solicit foreign investment from the West, Vietnam's turned to the Soviet Union for assistance and agreed to join the communist trade group Comecon. In October 1978, the Vietnamese premier, Pham Van Dong, went to Moscow for talks with the Soviet leadership. After bad storms and flooding, Vietnam was desperate to replace the aid China was withholding, and the status of the Soviet delegation indicated the importance Moscow gave to strengthening its ties with Vietnam. And it's this, Vietnam's Soviet connection, that's the most worrying aspect of the current conflict with China. Red Square, Moscow, the annual November parade marking the anniversary of the revolution. Nobody doubts the military might of the Soviet Union, and with such an ally behind it, Vietnam can easily afford to maintain its present position for some time. There's increasing speculation that the Soviets themselves might also put pressure on the Chinese and so dangerously internationalize the conflict. Is this likely? Mr. Bonavia again.
Right now, the Russians would probably prefer not to be directly involved because they would like to push through the signing of the SALT II agreement. They would like to continue building up their economy with a certain amount of technological and financial assistance from Western countries. A lot of that would probably go by the board if they were involved in an attack on China or a military action in support of Vietnam. However, there comes a point where the Russians have to establish their credibility, in the sense that only late last year they signed a treaty of alliance with Vietnam, which obliges them at least to consult with Vietnam if it requires military assistance. And my own guess would be that the Chinese and the Vietnamese can probably fight for about a fortnight without the Russians feeling the need to become specifically involved with military forces. But beyond that, I would think Russia has to do something or other. It might help the Vietnamese to recover the Paracels Islands in the South China Seas, which the Chinese took from the former South Vietnamese government in 1974, or it might even mount a diversionary action or something larger on China's northern or northwestern frontiers. At present, we really can't see even the direction of movement there. We can only see that the Soviet Union, after a week or two's fighting, would be very embarrassed at not having done anything at all.
China's border clashes with Vietnam, which had escalated into war by mid-February, have been defended by the Chinese in a propaganda film report they've just released.
They opened fire, and Liang Jian, a member of the Chinese patrol team, is wounded. People still remember the time when large numbers of sick or wounded Vietnamese soldiers received medical treatment in hospitals in Chinese border areas during the Vietnamese War of Resistance against US aggression. But today, in the very same hospitals are Chinese frontier guards who have been wounded by Vietnamese gunfire or mine explosions. This young soldier has been fired at by the Vietnamese aggressors and critically wounded in the head. This militiaman's legs have been broken by explosion of a field mine laid by the Vietnamese intruders. All these incidents of bloodshed are proofs of the perfidious deeds of the Vietnamese authorities. Militiamen in Ma Quan County, Yunnan Province, are mourning the martyrs killed by the Vietnamese armed forces. They are determined to settle the blood debts owed them by the Vietnamese authorities. The Vietnamese was frantically opposing China. Yu Guidong, a militiaman of the Pingxiang Friendship Commune, is denouncing the Vietnamese aggressors for massacring Chinese army men and civilians.
我叫于贵东，是中越边境平协市友谊公社隘口大队的民兵，同志们，你们看，我这个腿就是给越南地雷炸伤的。正当地雷响的时候，他们还用机枪向我扫射。这些越南当局追随所有侵略扩张的罪证，越南当局侵略者把我造成这样的残废。
We will not attack unless we are attacked. If we are attacked, we will certainly counterattack. Should the Vietnamese authorities willfully cling to their own course, history will eventually bring them before the bar of justice.
How do the two sides measure up militarily, and what's likely to be the outcome on the battlefield?
In terms of comparative strength, the Chinese are very much stronger than the Vietnamese. They have 6 or 7 times as many men and as many aircraft as the Vietnamese. They have a much greater capacity for reinforcement and for raising reserves. They have a much more advanced and efficient heavy industry to supply their armed forces. They haven't just been through a long war and had their economy shattered as the Vietnamese have. On the other hand, the Vietnamese, as everyone knows, are very able troops, very tough, and very well organized with a lot of experience. It will be very interesting, in fact, to see what comes out of this war, see whether the Chinese army has in fact got flabby in the wars of peace since the Korean War, as the Vietnamese have privately claimed, or whether in fact they're just as good as the Vietnamese after a few days' experience on the battlefield.
How do you see the overall pattern in Indochina in the future? Will it depend on military conquests or agreements to coexist?
Again, it's extremely hard to say because the pattern in Indochina, which appears to have been stable over the past 40 years, has been warfare. There's hardly been a year of peace in 40 years. So one is tempted to believe that in future there will be continuing warfare. The Vietnamese, for their part, apparently wanted to put an end to this by bringing Laos and Cambodia directly under their own control and establishing a zone where there wouldn't have to be war. However, that leaves out the consideration that Thailand and Vietnam have historically vied for control of the central portion of Indochina, and the possibility of, in the future, another Thai-Vietnamese military clash. Now the Chinese have come in again on the north. There seems to be very little likelihood of peace or stability in Indochina for perhaps a decade or two ahead.
The most likely.
For the Chinese border forces then, a doctrine of hatred and a sign that this is a region destined to remain a battleground. For the new regime in Peking is determined to prove it is no paper tiger, and that's a chilling prospect for the people here who are all too familiar with the horrors of war.